what I decided to do was to string together some number of short videos that talk about some of the things I did and some of the problems I had to solve in putting together and building this screened-in porch. And I thought I'd start with this first section over here. I call that section 1. And you'll notice that the screen type, or the way the screens are installed for section 1, are slightly different than the rest of the sections. You know, they outline those white frame pieces that outline this, outline each of the screens is different than the rest of the screened-in porch, and I'll talk about what caused that to happen. So come over here and take a quick look at this part of the house. There's this 45-degree wall that I had to deal with when I put in this section 1, and in order to install the screen tight system, you have to have access to the edge over here. You have to be able to drill some holes and screw in the base pieces for the screen tight system, apply it and put the cap on here. And this 45-degree wall just made that access impossible, so I had to solve that a different way when I put in section 1. So that's why you'll see that section 1 has, you know, these two pieces here that frame the screens, but section 2 over here just has one. So there's a little bit of difference between section 1 over here and the rest of the screen in Porch, but I'll talk about how I had to solve that problem in just a bit when I take you inside. So here's the inside of section 1 that I showed you the outside of just a little bit ago. And here's that 45-degree wall. And this was a real challenge to turn this 45-degree angle into something that I could nail well, not nail, but attach the frames to the wall and with a 90-degree solution. And what I had to do was, because I couldn't get access, as I described in just a second ago, I couldn't get access to being able to put the screen type product onto the frame because of the restrictions of that 45-degree wall. What I did was, for this section 1, I had to build a frame that outlines the screen. So this piece of wood here is a separate frame, and there's the screen tight installed on it. The screen's installed using screen tight. So there's a separate frame here, then down these lower sections there's a separate frame there. So I had to measure and cut and miter these angles, building the frame for the large upper section and then the two lower screen panels down here. Then I mounted the screen on those frames that I built, and then basically inserted those frames onto the large framing for the screen, and then attach them with screws. So if I ever needed to service this screen, I just take these screws out of the side here. There's just 4 of them, and this whole section, this whole frame, this whole screen panel just pops out. I can do whatever I need to do with the screen, and then just reinsert it into the frame. So that was kind of a unique challenge that I had to deal with for section 1. This section 1 was kind of a prototype or an experiment with the first section for the screened-in porch. I just wanted to see how it would work, and in fact my idea was to use the same method for all of the screen sections, but the time that it took to build those frames to be inserted into each section was so time consuming that I would have never finished. It was just too complicated and too time consuming, so I decided to just do it once to solve the problem for section 1, and then for the rest of the sections I just used a much simpler and slightly different solution to install the screens on the rest of them. For the rest of the screen sections, the process was different, a little bit different than what I went through for section 1. I changed it up a little bit, and then I repeated the process for the remaining section 2, 3, 4, 5, and section 6 was a little bit different because it's a different shape. But the process was basically the same. And what I did was I of course had to measure and cut for each screen section, and The pieces that went into it, of course, were, you know, the side pieces, this thing I call the chair rail. There's a top piece. Some people call it a top plate. Some people call it a header. So a piece of the framing up at the top, and then one at the bottom. And what I did was, the first thing that I had to do was to measure and cut what I call the top plate or the header, because what I wanted to have happen was I wanted to have that header piece to be precisely the same distance along the edge of that soffit up there, so that when you look up at the header you don't see something that's uneven or out of place. So I made sure that that top piece was properly measured and installed, so everything looked straight and even along that edge. And that was the first piece to go in, and everything else in the frame, everything else in the section was based on and positioned according to the location of that top piece. So I measured and cut that piece, weatherproofed it, and I'll talk about the weatherproofing process a little bit later. Weatherproofed it, and then hung everything else that is part of the frame based on the location of that header. So that was in place, and then I made sure that this bottom piece was positioned directly and exactly below the top piece, so that these side pieces that came down had to make sure that those were plumb and straight along the wall, and then everything else came together based on those side pieces being properly located. So that was, you know, part of the kind of the measuring and getting everything aligned part of that process. Another thing I had to take into account were some details, some little details that went into the measuring and cutting process. For example, you'll notice that this is the 2x4 lumber that is the main part of the frame, but then there's this piece of 1x4 that kind of is a part of each of the sections, each of the panels for the screen. There's this one here, there's another one there, there's one that goes along the bottom. It's hard to see, but you can see this kind of a strip there, and then this 1x4 that goes all along the edge. And I had to do that for a couple of reasons, but the main reason was because up here is this, what they call this, a freeze board. When they built the house, there's a piece of wood under here, the piece of trim that they put up here, and that freeze board was about 3/4 of an inch wide, and so I just couldn't mount this 2x4 lumber right up against the brick. I had to get it to stand off from that freeze board, so I had to put in this 3/4 inch wide, so 1x4 to go in between the brick and the 2x4. And another thing I had to do was the way that this soffit was framed with this, or built with this vinyl coated aluminum, had this channel that goes around it to hold everything in place. Well, when I mounted this header piece up here, I had to notch out a little tiny piece of this 1x4 so that it would fit snugly, or as snugly as possible, up against this soffit. So that was another little detail I had to mess with. And the other thing is that this is all pretty much 1x4 wood, but I was very careful about what I put down here. On the footer, that is not wood, that is PVC, so it's plastic, so that I would not have the wood touching the concrete. I wanted to make sure that because of the weather and the moisture, that the wood was not on the concrete. So everything down here along all of the footers, all of that stuff is PVC, so it's plastic, and that'll last a good long time. So the process for each one of these frames was basically repeated across the whole construction of the screen and porch, as I said before, measure and cut everything, mount the header. Well, even before that, measure and cut, and for each piece, each stick of wood that was used for the frame, I don't know if you've noticed it, but there's along some of the corners, there's this routed edge. My brother-in-law, Fred, suggested that I put a little decorative edge on here, and I took him up on that. But that meant that every time I measured and cut a piece of wood, I also had to figure out how I wanted the routing to be done. And I had to route every piece. For this centerpiece here, I had to route it twice, once here and once there. And even on this, what I call the chair rail, I had to route it up here, and then also underneath down here. There's a little paint I need to put back there. So everything had to be routed. And then I'd put up the header, make sure the footer was properly aligned, get everything in place. Even before that, I had to weatherproof everything, and I'll talk about the weatherproofing process in a little bit. So it wasn't just cut the wood and mount it. It was cut the wood, route it, weatherproof it, get it in position, line it all up, screw it in place. So it was a pretty involved process for each section. The weatherproofing process was pretty involved, and it was pretty time consuming, because not only did I have to measure, cut, and route everything for all the pieces that went in place, but once the routing was done and the wood was pretty much prepped, but it was still unfinished, the weatherproofing process involved taking each piece of wood, everything except for the polyurethane at the bottom, because it didn't need to be weatherproof, just needed to be painted. But every piece of wood was given 3 coats of an oil-based polyurethane, and that stuff took about 3 hours to dry between coats, so there was a whole day right there. And then after the polyurethane was dried and cured, then all the wood was given a coat of primer. And then after the primer was dry, which didn't take very long, primer dried in about less than 2 hours, then all the wood was given 2 coats of exterior paint. So every time I measured and cut and routed everything, I had to stop what I was doing and then weatherproof with polyurethane primer and paint. And what I tried to do was, especially the polyurethane, which took so long to dry, as that was doing its thing, then I'd move on to the next section and start measuring and potentially cutting out for the next section, so that I could kind of keep the process going. It didn't always go that way, but that's what I tried to do. And in all this process, I had to do little tiny things, like I talked about cutting out that notch up there and over there, and it was really a tedious process. And that weatherproofing process that I'm talking about is one of the things that made Section 1, my solution for Section 1, something I could not duplicate or did not want to duplicate for the rest of the sections, because I had to go through that weatherproofing process for each of these frames, for each screen section. Once I figured out what the angles were and miter the edges and glue and nail it together and get it all properly constructed, then I had to stop and I had to weatherproof those frames. And I thought, if I have to do this for all the rest of the porch, I'll never finish. So I decided to simplify the process a little bit. Now, as far as weatherproofing is concerned, you might justifiably ask, why did I not use pressure-treated lumber? Well, here are the reasons that answer that question. First of all, I have it on good authority that the EPA has mandated a change to the formula used for pressure-treated lumber, and that new formula just doesn't last as long. Pressure-treated lumber doesn't last as long as it used to. Another reason is that I read that if you use pressure-treated lumber, it has to sit for about 90 days in order to dry out, and I wasn't about to wait that long to use the wood, plus the fact that when it dries out it might twist and warp, and I needed to have something that was straight and reliable, so I wasn't about to go through that whole process. And the last reason is because I had built something out of plywood a long time ago, and I coated it in 3 or 4 layers of polyurethane, and this piece of plywood, actually it's a sail box. It's been mounted on my sailboat trailer and has been out in the weather for more than 30 years, and with that polyurethane coating, that plywood sail box is still in good shape, so I know that polyurethane is something that's going to last for a long time. So that's why I chose to use 3 coats of polyurethane, primer, and 2 coats of paint. I'm sure that that is more than adequate weatherproofing for the kind of weather that the screened-in porch is going to see. And maybe you saw the short video on the Screen Tight, that sort of that short demo I did on the Screen Tight product. When the Screen Tight system, when the screens are installed, the Screen Tight, what it looks like on the inside here is this black strip here. It looks kind of black. It's really kind of a dark brown. That's the Screen Tight base that I talked about in that video, and you can see the white Screen Tight cap on the outside. So when you look at this, at the screen panels, the screen sections from the inside, you see that strip of black and the strip of white for the Screen Tight products. And part of the construction process was to make sure that when the screens were installed, when the Screen Tight base and cap were installed, especially the base, because the base is what establishes, you know, kind of the line and the look of the Screen Tight, is that it all had to be straight. So if you look at each of these 4 pieces of each screen panel, I had to make sure that that everything was installed, so things didn't look, you know, misaligned or uneven for each of the screen panels. So that took a little bit of deliberate planning and execution as well. As far as actually attaching the lumber to the brick and forming up each section on the porch, you probably noticed these brackets here. These are stainless steel brackets and stainless steel screws. So all of the components of each section are attached with these brackets and screws, both on the top and on the bottom down here, and of course along the footer and up there on the header. And not only that, but the footer, you can't see some of them, but there's a Tapcon screw here that goes down into the concrete, and there are others along the bottom. And because I wanted this chair rail piece to be firmly attached, the side pieces are attached with Tapcon screws as well. But I only put one down here and one there. I did not put Tapcons further up, because this header is attached with screws up into the framing, so that's very solid. This is attached with that angle bracket up there, so that's pretty solid up there, solid enough. These Tapcons down here, these 2 Tapcons, make this section very solid. And what my intention was is I wanted people to be able to, you know, lean or push on these chair rails and not have it give or move or flex. And when I did the first section the same way, I was remarkably surprised at how, well, I was surprised at how remarkably strong these sections were installed. They don't give it all. They're extremely solid, extremely firm. So I was really happy with the way that the frames, the wooden frames, went together and stayed in place so firmly, and they're pretty solid construction. So that's kind of an overall summary of the construction process for, I keep putting my finger in front of the camera, I apologize for that. A summary of a lot of the construction stuff that I had to do. There's an owl, there's a fake owl that I had to put here because I came out one day and there was a squirrel down here. I mean, it was like the day after I'd finished the screened-in porch project, and there was a squirrel over here that was tearing up the screen and trying to get into the porch. I don't know why. It just really made me mad. And I told anybody who would listen that if I find that squirrel in the porch, I was going to kill it. There's going to be squirrel blood in the porch. But I got this fake owl here to try to scare him away. So far it seems to have worked. Anyway, so all this came together. One of the things that stopped me for a short time was down here, the slab for the porch had cracked and popped loose. So I repaired enough of it to be able to put in this one section. But you can still see maybe it's still cracked and a little bulging up a little bit there. I need to get a grinder out there and fix the rest of it. That's a pretty ugly piece of the slab, but it didn't stop me. Once I fixed that one section there, it didn't stop me from putting in that section 5. But that was something else that, you know, was going along, and then looked down there and thought, oh my gosh, now I got to fix that thing. This last section, section 6, was it's smaller than the other sections, but it was fairly complicated because this, of course, is a section with the door, and that section had to be built in such a way that that door went in straight. So when I bought this door, it's not like it wasn't like a pre-hung door that had the frame and everything, and the hinges were attached and all that. I had to build the entire frame for the door and make as absolutely sure as possible that the door frame was level up there and plumb on the sides, and to make sure that the door would hang right, so that you didn't look at the door and see it was all crooked and crazy. So that took a lot of time. I've never built a door frame before. I've never had the pleasure of mortising a frame and a door for hinges and stuff. So I had to kind of learn all that stuff and be very careful. Which is why, when you look at pieces of the framing here, if I put the camera right here, you can see daylight through the framing right there, and that's because this piece of wood here had to be. I hope you can see that because of the exposure. That piece of wood there had to be lined up with other pieces of the porch frame. I'm trying to get a good exposure here so you can see what I'm talking about. Had to be lined up with other pieces of the porch frame, like the routing, the way the routing is done in the header. I needed to make sure it was centered there, and I need to make sure it was properly aligned down here. And I figured I would get that straight, and then, like most doors, the way most doors are mounted, you compensate for variations and imperfections in the door frame by putting shims in. So that's exactly what I did. When I got that first piece of wood in there, that was reasonably straight and plumb, but it wasn't as exact as it needed to be. So I put in this piece of the door frame here, and then you can see there's a shim there, there's another shim there, there's some shims there, and maybe a little bit down here, to get that last piece perfectly plumb so that the door would be square. And I didn't have as much of a problem here. This column was pretty plumb, so this section here went in pretty easily without having to do too much to it. But I had to do a lot of messing around to get that part straight, and of course I had to get that top piece level, the piece of the frame above the door. I had to get that level as well. So that was a kind of new experience to me. That was another complication that added to the sort of the learning process and the final construction. That was the last section I had to do, so I wanted to make sure I got that right. So here's what that last section looks like from the outside, and there's that door that I was talking about just a little bit ago, and you can see that it's pretty straight around the door frame. I'm pretty happy with the way it turned out, and the hinges went on real well. The measurements turned out okay, and one of the things I forgot to mention when I was talking about this door on the inside is that the edge over there where the shims are, with that little bit of a gap, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put some molding up there to on the inside and on the outside as well, because you can sort of see a gap. Like if I get a little closer here, where the shims are. Here's a shim here, there's another one up there, and there's this gap that you can look right through into the porch. I'm going to put some molding here to cover that gap, so a lot of problems and mistakes and stuff can be covered up and solved with molding. The jets are flying overhead. There's a bank of flights coming into the airport. They're up there at about 3,000 feet, but they're pretty noisy. But anyway, so yeah, the door went in pretty well. I'm pretty happy with that. I got to put a door sweep at the bottom because there's a gap along the bottom of the door, so I'll take care of that. The door handle went on real well. I was happy about that. One thing that I had not done yet is put one of those closers, you know, those pneumatic closers on the door. Probably put it up top, but that's something else I have to do as well. But other than those things, you know, a little bit of trim and a few other odds and ends, the porch is done. The project is pretty much wrapped up, and I am pretty pleased with it. It took a long time to do. It took about a year to finish it, but it finally came together.